The moment Jasmine Crockett walked into the hearing room, you could feel something was different. The cameras were already fixed on Kristi Noem, her practiced smile aimed at every lens like she owned the place. But the second Jasmine sat down, blue folder in hand, no entourage, no forced pleasantries, the energy shifted. Noem didn't seem to notice. She was too busy rehearsing her opening statement under her breath, too confident that this would be just another performance. Another day of lofty speeches about family values and American grit that no one dared to question. Until Jasmine did. The chairman tapped his mic, announced the session had begun, and in that instant, the hum of side conversations died. Every head turned. "Governor Noem," Jasmine said, her tone impossibly calm, "before you begin reading from your prepared remarks, I have one question." Noem looked up, surprised. She hadn't expected to be challenged before she even started. "Congresswoman Crockett," she replied with a polite edge, "I'd appreciate the courtesy of—" "You'll have plenty of time to spin your narrative," Jasmine cut in, her voice steady enough to freeze the room. "But right now, I'd like you to look at this." She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A simple printout. At first glance, it looked like any other briefing document. But as Noem's eyes landed on the header, something in her face tightened. It was a memo. Marked confidential. Dated only 3 months prior. In clear, official language, it described an internal report from Noem's own administration, detailing how federal emergency funds meant to support pandemic recovery had been rerouted to pet projects that benefited her biggest donors. For a second, no one moved. Noem's lips parted, but no words came out. "You called these funds a lifeline for working families," Jasmine said, her voice low but unshakably clear. "But this document shows you diverted millions to friends and political allies. And then you told the American people it was about relief." A single camera flash exploded in the back of the room. The reporters were already texting their editors. "Would you like to explain," Jasmine continued, leaning in just slightly, "how that's anything but a betrayal of public trust?" The hearing was barely 3 minutes old, and already, everyone knew this wasn't going to be the day Kristi Noem expected. This wasn't just politics anymore. It was something far bigger, and for the first time in a long time, Kristi Noem looked like she knew it. For one impossible moment, you could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the room. The memo sat between them like a lit fuse, daring Kristi Noem to touch it, to pretend it wasn't real. Her fingers hovered above the page, but she didn't pick it up. Instead, she looked across at Jasmine with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That document," she began slowly, "was an internal draft. It has no legal—" "Stop," Jasmine said, her voice low but lethal. A gasp rippled across the rows of staffers and journalists. Noem wasn't used to being interrupted, certainly not by someone who refused to shrink in her presence. "You don't get to hide behind semantics," Jasmine continued, her tone steady as stone. "This isn't about whether the memo was final. It's about the truth. You siphoned public money during a crisis. Then you stood in front of cameras and told families scraping by on unemployment that you were fighting for them." Noem's jaw clenched. For a second, she looked like she might explode, like she might finally drop the calm veneer she'd worn her entire political life. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She reached into her folder again and pulled out a second document. This one wasn't stamped confidential. It was a series of emails, obtained through a public records request. She read aloud, her voice measured, each word landing like a hammer. "Governor Noem has made clear she expects these allocations to prioritize projects with visibility and high donor engagement. Keep this correspondence off the official ledger." A hush fell so complete that the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead sounded deafening. "Would you like to deny that this is your chief of staff's email?" Jasmine asked, her eyes locked on Noem's. For a fraction of a second, Noem looked small, just another politician caught in the gap between her speeches and her actions. She swallowed, her voice tight. I can't comment on internal staff communications taken out of context. Jasmine tilted her head, studying her with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite disdain. You've spent years branding yourself as the champion of integrity, she said softly. But when people needed you most, when the country was on its knees, you exploited their fear to buy influence. A young reporter in the third row was typing so fast his fingers blurred. Another staffer's phone buzzed with an alert. Already, the headlines were breaking. Noem accused of diverting COVID relief funds. But Jasmine wasn't reading headlines. She was looking directly into Noem's eyes. And for the first time, Kristi Noem didn't have a polished line ready. She looked down at the table. The moment stretched, electric and raw. Because no matter how many press releases she would issue later, no matter how many loyal pundits would rush to spin it, everyone watching had just seen the truth. And Jasmine Crockett made sure they'd never forget it. The chairman cleared his throat, but even he looked reluctant to interrupt. Attention had settled over the hearing, brittle, undeniable. Kristi Noem straightened in her seat, trying to recover the composure that had carried her through countless interviews and stump speeches. She folded her hands neatly, as if she could will herself back into control. Congresswoman Crockett, she began carefully, I understand you want to make a point, but this is an attack, not a discussion. You're politicizing a crisis that hurt everyone. Jasmine didn't look away. Her expression didn't change. I'm not politicizing anything, she replied, her voice low and sure. I'm showing receipts. She held up the email again, just high enough for the cameras to capture the subject line in bold black letters. Prioritizing high-visibility projects. A murmur swept the gallery. Noem's face colored, a flush rising along her neck. She opened her mouth to respond, but Jasmine was already speaking. You say you care about the people of this country, Jasmine continued, her tone somehow even softer, more dangerous for its restraint. But when those same people lost their jobs, their homes, and their loved ones, you saw an opportunity. You built a brand off their desperation. She paused, letting the words sink in. You told them it was leadership. It was marketing. A hush so thick it felt like a physical thing pressed over the hearing. Noem shifted in her chair. This is out of context. No, Jasmine said sharply. Context is exactly what you've spent your career stripping away. You think you can just cherry-pick your successes and bury the rest. The chairman glanced nervously at the clock, but no one else looked away. This isn't about me, Noem tried again, her voice cracking just slightly. It's about a country that needed unity. Then why, Jasmine asked, her eyes locked to Noem's, did your office direct funds to a golf resort renovation while rural hospitals in your state were rationing ventilators? The words hit like a thunderclap. A reporter in the back actually gasped. For the first time, Noem had nothing to say. Jasmine leaned back a fraction, her expression unreadable. I came here today, she said slowly, not to grandstand, not to score points. I came because when the history of this crisis is written, the American people deserve to know who was fighting for them, and who was fighting for themselves. Noem swallowed hard. She was blinking rapidly now, struggling to find a line that would erase the image Jasmine had just painted, a leader who had turned a moment of collective grief into a personal billboard. The cameras captured it all. Every stutter. Every falter. Every flicker of guilt that no press release could disguise. And Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just let the silence do what it always did best, expose the truth. The hearing room felt colder now, like someone had opened a door to a blizzard no one could escape. Even the aides in the back, trained to keep their expressions neutral, were glancing at each other in disbelief. Jasmine flipped the folder shut with quiet finality. The sound, a soft thwop, seemed to echo louder than any gavel. Noem licked her lips and tried to steady her breathing. You could see it in her eyes, the calculation, the scramble to find a line that would make this look like just another partisan scuffle. But Jasmine didn't give her the chance. "You want to talk about unity," she said, her voice calm but edged in steel. "Let's talk about the families in Pine Ridge Reservation who waited weeks for testing kits you promised. Or the nursing home staff forced to use rain ponchos as PPE because the supply shipments you touted at press conferences never arrived." Noem opened her mouth, closed it again. Jasmine leaned in slightly, her tone dropping to something almost intimate. "I've read every statement you've given on this crisis. Every press release about your so-called leadership. And the only consistency is the way you've erased the truth in favor of your brand." The chairman's gavel hovered in his hand, but he didn't bring it down. Not yet. Maybe he knew this was the moment people would replay 100 times over. "This is bigger than politics," Jasmine said, gesturing to the cameras, to the room, to the watching country. "This is about whether public service means something, or whether it's just another stage for the ambitious to sell their story." Noem's voice came out thin. "Congresswoman Crockett, I will not be lectured by someone who—" But she didn't finish the sentence. Because Jasmine wasn't even looking at her anymore. She was speaking to everyone else. "Look around," she said. "Look at the headlines, look at the timelines. When it was time to choose between helping people and helping yourself, you chose yourself. And the evidence isn't going away." A camera zoomed in. The red recording light glowed like an accusation. Noem sat back, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. And Jasmine, voice low but unshakable, delivered the final cut of this round. "You can call this partisan. You can call it an attack. But when people buried their loved ones, you were booking airtime. When children went hungry, you were writing speeches about how much you cared. And when the dust settles, no spin doctor in America will be able to make people forget what you did." A hush fell so complete you could hear someone's pen roll across the floor. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't empty. It was the kind that meant 1,000 people watching from home had just decided where their sympathy, and their rage, belonged. And for the first time, Kristi Noem looked like she realized she couldn't spin her way out. If anyone in that hearing room still believed this was going to end with a polite exchange of talking points, Jasmine Crockett shattered the illusion. Kristi Noem's aides shifted in their seats, eyes darting to the exit as if wishing they could slip out before the cameras swung in their direction. But Jasmine was relentless. She didn't raise her voice, didn't pound the table. She didn't have to. Her composure was the weapon, steady, deliberate, and impossible to dismiss. "Governor Noem," she said, her gaze locked on the woman across from her, "you've built your entire career on the idea that you're different. That you're authentic, unbought. But your record tells a different story." She lifted another document from the folder, a chart this time. Bright red numbers against a field of pale blue. "This is the breakdown," she continued, tapping the chart with one perfectly manicured finger, "of pandemic relief funds allocated to rural health clinics versus high-visibility infrastructure projects. You called this balanced investment. I call it selective generosity, paid for by taxpayers who trusted you." Noem tried to form a rebuttal, but Jasmine didn't pause. "You've said over and over that you stand with working families," she pressed on. "Tell me, did those families get a say when you funneled millions into grants that just happened to be awarded to contractors you'd campaigned alongside?" A ripple of murmurs swept through the spectators. Jasmine flipped to the next page, a photo this time. A ribbon-cutting ceremony with Noem in the center, beaming beside a donor whose company had been awarded a no-bid contract. "Because when you were out there celebrating this," Jasmine continued, lifting the photo for everyone to see, "people in your own state were calling helplines, begging for rent assistance you never bothered to prioritize." Noem shifted again, her polished demeanor cracking under the weight of her silence. Jasmine let the moment breathe. "This isn't about a single bad decision," she said quietly. "It's about a pattern of using crisis as a ladder, of treating public service like a brand you can market on morning shows. A young woman in the back, a staffer, maybe an intern, blinked hard, her expression stricken. You could see it dawn on her, the distance between the slogans and the reality. Jasmine lowered the photo and set it on the stack of evidence. "I don't expect you to admit any of this today," she said evenly. "I don't expect you to look at that chart or those emails and feel shame. But you should." Noem swallowed hard, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Because when the cameras are off," Jasmine finished, her voice turning soft but no less lethal, "when there's no press release to hide behind, you're going to remember this hearing. And so will every person who ever trusted you." Silence followed. The kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Because the truth was sitting on the table, undeniable and documented. And Jasmine Crockett had made sure everyone saw it. Kristi Noem's hand drifted to her water glass, but she didn't drink. Her fingers just hovered there, as if the motion alone could anchor her in the storm Jasmine had unleashed. Around them, the hearing room felt smaller, like the walls were inching closer with every second she refused to respond. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't look away. Her voice, when it came again, was soft, so soft it forced the room to lean in just to catch it. "Do you remember what you said at your last campaign rally?" she asked. "I watched the clip this morning. You stood in front of an audience of working people, farmers, teachers. And you said, 'I'll always put you first, no matter the cost.'" She let the words hang there, her eyes steady. "You said that as though it was a promise," Jasmine continued. "But for so many in your state, it was just another line." Noem swallowed, her throat bobbing. "I understand that public service is hard," Jasmine said. "I understand that no leader is perfect. But there's a difference between imperfection and exploitation." She gestured to the folder, the pages fanned across the table like a ledger of every line Noem had ever tried to bury. "This is what happens when you forget the people who put their trust in you," she said. "When you think you can use their struggle as a stepping stone, then leave them behind." Noem opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Congresswoman," she managed finally, her voice thinner than it had been all day, "these accusations are politically motivated. You know that." Jasmine's expression didn't flicker. "No," she said, her tone deceptively gentle. "I know exactly what motivated me. I didn't come here to protect my seat, or to score headlines. I came here because somebody has to tell the truth while you're still sitting in that chair." A staffer scribbled something on a notepad so fast the paper nearly tore. The camera zoomed in, recording every tremor in Noem's hands, every unblinking second of Jasmine's stare. "This isn't just about your record," Jasmine went on. "It's about a question bigger than any one of us." She looked around the hearing room, her gaze sweeping across the rows of aides and reporters, the lawmakers who had once looked bored but now sat pinned by the gravity of her words. "What kind of country do we want to be?" she asked quietly. "Do we want to be the kind of country where leaders think they can build careers out of people's suffering, and never be held accountable?" The question hovered there, impossible to escape. Noem didn't answer. Because there was nothing left to say that could soften the truth Jasmine had laid bare. And in that moment, more than any press conference, more than any campaign commercial, everyone watching knew exactly who Kristi Noem was. And who Jasmine Crockett was, too. The chairman shifted uneasily in his seat, but even he didn't try to cut Jasmine off. It was clear to everyone in the room that this wasn't political theater, it was something closer to a reckoning. Jasmine lifted her chin just slightly, and for a moment, she looked almost tired. But it wasn't the fatigue of someone who'd run out of fight. It was the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying the weight of other people's stories for too long. "You know," she said softly, "when I was a public defender, I sat across from a lot of people who had made mistakes. Real mistakes. But even then, they usually admitted it. They took responsibility, because they knew they'd been caught." She gestured to the evidence laid out on the table, emails, allocations, photos, quotes. A paper trail that no consultant could spin away. But here, she continued, her voice turning quieter still, we have a different kind of dishonesty. The kind that puts on a polished smile and says, I'm doing this for you. Her eyes locked on Noem. You weren't doing this for them, Jasmine said. You were doing it for yourself. A hush rippled through the room. Noem pressed her lips together, her breath coming quicker than before. She looked like she might finally snap, like the reality she'd spent so long avoiding had finally landed too close to outrun. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The truth had its own momentum. You took federal money meant for hospitals, she went on, and spent it on projects that made you look good. You bragged about your leadership while mothers waited in line at food banks you never visited. She paused, the words landing like the slow beat of a drum. You turned crisis into opportunity. And you thought no one would call you out. A young woman in the back wiped her eyes. It wasn't the politics of it, it was the familiarity. Everyone knew what it felt like to be promised something by someone who had no intention of keeping their word. Noem looked up, her voice hoarse. You think you have all the answers? Jasmine shook her head once, slowly. No, she said. But I have the receipts. That was it, the line that would replay on 1,000 broadcasts before the day was over. Jasmine didn't need to yell. She didn't need to stand. The quiet certainty in her voice was more devastating than any shouted accusation. For a moment, no one moved. Even the reporters seemed to forget their cameras. Because this was the moment the whole country would remember, the day someone finally looked Kristi. The eye and refused to let her slip away behind slogans. Jasmine didn't reach for more papers. She didn't need to. The silence itself was an indictment, 1,000 unspoken questions filling every inch of space between them. Noem drew in a shaky breath. You can twist this however you want, she said, voice raw. But I stand by my record. Jasmine studied her for a moment, and the pity was gone. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was something colder. Something that sounded like finality. You don't get to rewrite the facts, she said quietly. You don't get to wrap yourself in patriotism while you sell out the very people you swore to protect. Her gaze didn't waver. Do you think the single mother in Pierre who lost her job, and her health insurance, cares about your excuses? Do you think the nurse who watched 3 patients die in the same week because the ICU ran out of ventilators cares that you stand by your record? Noem's mouth opened, then closed. Jasmine pressed on, her voice so measured it felt almost gentle. You want to talk about sacrifice? She asked. Let's talk about the teachers you forced back into classrooms without protection. The elderly who couldn't get medicine. The children who went to bed hungry while you stood on a stage and bragged about balanced budgets. The hush deepened, thick with the kind of reckoning that couldn't be smoothed over. And when they asked you why, Jasmine continued, you called it leadership. She folded her hands on the table, her face calm. This isn't about whether you're Republican or Democrat. It's about whether you remember who you work for. Kristi Noem's eyes darted around the chamber, searching for an ally, a friendly face, anything to prove she wasn't alone. But no one met her gaze. Because everyone had seen what Jasmine laid bare. This moment, Jasmine said, is the moment history will remember. Not the rallies, not the hashtags. This. The day you were given the chance to own the harm you caused, and you chose to pretend it was someone else's fault. She paused, letting her words settle like a final verdict. I'm not here to humiliate you, she finished. I'm here to remind you, and everyone watching, that the truth doesn't care how you feel about it. Somewhere behind the cameras, a reporter exhaled audibly. And in that breath, the country watching knew, no matter how many statements Noem's office issued in the hours to come, nothing would erase the image of her sitting here, stripped of pretense. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed a scandal, she had exposed a mindset. The mindset that believed no one would ever dare to hold it accountable. By the time Jasmine finished, even the marble walls of the hearing room felt like they were leaning in to listen. The hush wasn't polite anymore, it was electric. Noem's face was pale, her hand trembling just slightly as she smoothed her notes into a stack she didn't dare look at. One of her aides leaned in to whisper something, but she didn't seem to hear. Because in that instant, all the carefully managed narratives, every speech, every talking point, had collapsed under the weight of evidence she couldn't dismiss. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her calm was its own quiet judgment. "I want you to understand something," she said softly, voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "This isn't personal. It's principled." She looked down at her hands, then back up, her eyes brighter than the cameras capturing every second. "When my mother worked nights cleaning hospital rooms, she believed that if you did your job and told the truth, you earned respect," she said. "But I've learned that some people think power entitles them to something more, that it excuses them from accountability." Noem's eyes flicked up, something like a plea in them. But Jasmine's gaze didn't soften. "You asked for this office," she continued. "You asked for the trust of millions. You took an oath, Governor Noem." She leaned in, her voice low and unflinching. "And every time you decided to spend relief funds on a donor project instead of a clinic, every time you chose a headline over a hospital, you broke it." A young man with a press badge pressed a hand over his mouth like he couldn't believe he was hearing it said out loud. "You want to call this political," Jasmine said, "because it's easier than admitting you failed." She lifted the folder once more, tapping it gently. "But these aren't my words. They're yours. Your budgets. Your emails. Your decisions." Noem looked like she might be sick. Jasmine closed the folder with deliberate care and set it aside. "I won't drag this out," she said. "Because the truth is simple enough to stand on its own." She folded her hands again. "I don't care how many interviews you do tomorrow, or how many statements you release. Because none of them will change the fact that when your constituents needed you, you weren't there." A pin could have dropped in the silence that followed. "And that," Jasmine finished, "is something no spin doctor will ever erase." It wasn't rage. It wasn't even contempt. It was a final, quiet truth, the kind that stayed with you longer than any shouting match. And across America, millions were already watching, replaying the moment in real time. Because this wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reminder that no one, no matter how polished, no matter how powerful, is untouchable when the facts finally catch up. When Jasmine Crockett finally leaned back, the entire room seemed to exhale with her. The tension didn't vanish, it settled deeper, like a bruise you couldn't rub away. Kristi Noem didn't look up. She stared at her folded hands, lips pressed so tight the color had drained from them. Whatever speech she'd prepared was gone, burned to ash by a truth too plain to deny. The chairman cleared his throat, voice low. "Governor Noem, you may respond." For a moment, it looked like she might try. Her shoulders lifted, her mouth opened, then closed again. The cameras never blinked. And Jasmine, watching her without malice or triumph, spoke one final time. "You don't have to answer," she said quietly. "Because you already did. Every time you chose to pretend your power made you special. Every time you decided the rules weren't meant for you. That was your answer." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "And the people you failed, they heard you loud and clear." A chill rippled through the chamber. Jasmine glanced toward the gallery, toward the reporters scribbling furiously and the aides who couldn't quite meet her gaze. "This hearing isn't just about you," she continued, turning back to Noem. "It's about every official who thinks they can lie and spin and hide, and still call themselves a servant of the people." Noem didn't move. "And it's about proving them wrong." Jasmine folded her notes with calm precision, her every movement deliberate. "This is bigger than politics," she said. It's about who we are when no one's watching, and who we become when someone finally does. A few rows back, an older reporter set his pen down, his eyes bright with something between respect and grief. He knew he was watching history, not because it was explosive, but because it was honest. Jasmine stood. Slowly. With the same steady composure that had carried her through every word. She didn't look at Noem again. She didn't need to. Because the truth had already landed. It would outlive every rebuttal, every press conference, every deflection that followed. It would live in the minds of every voter who saw it, every family who felt it, every person who'd been told to sit down and be quiet while their leaders pretended to care. Jasmine paused at the table's edge. She glanced back once, not at Noem, but at the country watching through 1,000 screens. And her voice, soft but unshakable, carried one final message. This isn't over. Then she walked out, no applause, no triumphant music. Just the sound of a woman who refused to be silent. And in that silence, the truth rang louder than any headline. If you were moved by what you just witnessed, by the courage it takes to stand up to power and the clarity it takes to tell the truth, don't let this moment fade. Share it. Talk about it. And remember, accountability doesn't happen on its own. It happens when we demand it. Because no matter how polished someone looks on camera, the truth always shows up in the end.